So in this session, we're going to look at how we can create sustainable businesses. My name is Michael Young, and I'll be presenting on this particular topic. Now, I spent a fair bit of time traveling the world. I've had the opportunity to work with people across a range of different countries, and whilst my background has largely been in the project management and strategy formulation and implementation space, what I've found is that through traveling around the world, presenting at different topics in different countries, and discussing things with professionals in all corners of the globe, what I'm finding is that sustainability is obviously an emerging trend, an emerging theme. And I guess the way I look at it is that whilst I might have had a background in some of these areas, my sort of original degree was in geography, and sort of back in the day, that was what is now known as resource and environmental management, or sustainable development. What I find is that there are many sustainability aspects that are becoming more prevalent and becoming part of everyday thinking. From a strategy perspective, and I guess this is the way I approach sustainability, is that what I identify is that for many businesses, when they're actually creating and developing their strategies or trying to implement them, what I often find is they tend to take an inside-out view, and so they tend to be looking at setting some goals or some targets based upon what they currently know or do. And the challenge that this creates is that they're not actually necessarily thinking about the big picture. They're not necessarily thinking about the big trends and drivers that are happening externally, and they're not thinking about those big shifts that are occurring in the sort of the environment they operate in, or the markets they operate in, or even in the world around them. And so sort of the mental picture, or the analogy I like to use, is it's like the salmon swimming up the stream. And whilst it takes a lot of work to swim against the current or swim against the tide, if that current or that tide is very strong, what in fact happens is the salmon actually gets washed back out to sea and can't actually make any progress. And so this is really what I often see with many businesses. They're trying to put in place strategies or set some goals or targets, which often mean they're swimming against the tide. The currents or the big trends are pushing them backwards, and it makes them very difficult to actually achieve those goals. So as I mentioned, I've spent many years traveling around the world, speaking to business leaders and project executives, and those working in strategy implementation in many different countries. And so I'm often out speaking to crowds, and so society thinks that I'm sort of a presenter. Mum thinks I'm sort of George Clooney, where I'm traveling around the world. Hopefully I'm not sacking people like George was doing in this particular movie. All my colleagues, they always see the happy snaps or the photographs from different parts of the world, and obviously, we're seeing lots of interesting places, but quite often or not, I'm spending a lot of time traveling. And so whilst sort of full disclosure, I am collecting Hard Rock Cafe shirts. I've got about 75, only which of about 2 are from the US. I am traveling to lots of different places. All my friends think that I'm traveling in private jets. I'd like to think that here I am at the United Nations headquarters in New York, speaking to business leaders from around the world. I'd like to think that that's what I'm doing, but the reality is that I'm actually spending a lot of time squashed into aircraft seats trying to work. And so, funnily enough, often I spend, in some instances, more time on a plane than I do in some of these countries. I got told off a couple of years ago by a border guard in Zurich, where I had to travel for 3 days to attend a workshop for 2 days. He sort of said, "Oh, you stupid Australian, why are you here? You've travelled so far. You need to spend more time here." So to get us into the zone, get us into the thinking, we need to start considering what are some of the big burning issues facing the world today. Often these are things that are outside of our everyday. They're things that are outside of our industry, outside of our sector, usually outside of our city, outside of our country. And in fact, they're big burning issues that are occurring around us. And because we're busy with our heads down and just doing what we do, often we don't actually stop and think about or even take notice of some of these big issues. And so what I'm going to do is provide a bit of an overview, a bit of a snapshot as to where we're at. So where are we now? So there's 7.72 billion people on the planet. There's about 8.97 billion mobile phone connections. And what's been really interesting is that in the 2 years that I've been presenting on this particular topic, what I've seen is that there's been an increase in around about 2 billion mobile phones. There's 70 million refugees and rising. We have 86% of the population on the planet living in developing countries. We've got 15 major wars, and this last one actually took me by surprise when I was doing the research for this, is that the leading cause of death in the world is actually pollution. Many people think it would be cancer, or maybe it's malnutrition or something, but in fact it's actually from pollution. Now, when we actually go and look at some of the big issues we're seeing economically, housing affordability is a big problem. And so here we've got a graph of housing affordability over the period of about 20 to 30 years. And what we're seeing here on the horizontal axis is the number of years, and on the vertical axis is the multiple of the median incomes. And so we can see here that Sydney and Melbourne, the red and the brown graphs, are well and truly above about 7 times the median income. So 7 times is the point at which housing becomes unaffordable. We can see though that many of the other average house prices across the other major capitals in Australia are not that far behind. Obviously we're seeing a few fluctuations, and with the recent impacts of housing price reductions, it's probably making it a little bit easier for people to afford it, but we can see here that we're well and truly outside the level of affordability. When we go and look at world population growth, what we see is that there's actually more people living in this circle than on all the rest of the planet. Now, we can see, of course, that we've got India and China here, and so we've got very large populations in those areas. But what becomes really interesting is if we start to think about some of the bigger picture issues, we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years a globalization of markets occurring. What we're seeing is that we're seeing many more goods and services being made in, products in particular being made in China, but we're seeing a lot of outsourcing of services to places like the Philippines over the last couple of years. And so there's a lot more outsourcing and offshoring, and there's been big business process outsourcing centres set up in the Philippines, and many people have degrees that are equivalent to, or they've got degrees from Western universities, and they have similar experience to many people working in places like Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, but they're working at roughly 10% of the salaries that we'd be expecting here in Australia. And so we're seeing an interesting shift. What becomes really interesting though is when we start to look at where the population growth is likely to occur, we can see that there's likely to be a 32.5% increase over the next 30 odd years. And so by 2050, we're expecting there to be around about 9.7 billion people on the planet. The population growth, though, is going to happen in Asia and Oceania. We're seeing 20% in Asia and 48% within Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Obviously, we're going to see a large increase in places like Africa, but interestingly, we're going to see a significant decrease in Europe of around about 4%. Now, the population itself is also ageing, and so, as we've known for many years in Australia, we have an ageing population. And this creates some challenges, but also some opportunities. Obviously, as the population ages, we're going to have less people actually working, and we're going to have less people paying tax, and that's going to have a significant implication for government taxation revenue. But it also creates some interesting opportunities because obviously with a growing ageing population, not just within Australia, but across the board, around the world, we're seeing opportunities to actually investments in services and equipment and property related to aged care and so on. So when we look at the Asian and Southeast Asian regions, we see some interesting environmental challenges presenting themselves as well. And so, as I mentioned, pollution is one of the leading causes of death or premature death. We're seeing in places like Indonesia, we've got some real challenges. We're seeing forests being cut down to make way for grazing land, And we're also seeing that a lot of the trees that are cut down are actually being burnt and to get rid of the timber. And so we're seeing pollution from fires. We're also seeing a significant number of cars in cities, and in some days, or not some days, in places like Jakarta, there's significant toxic air, so much so that your eyes actually burn, and so many people on certain days can't go outdoors. Now, Great Barrier Reef is a interesting scenario, and so over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen 3 significant coral bleaching events, and we're seeing roughly half of the Great Barrier Reef looks like this. It's been bleached. Now, the reef will recover over about a 12 to 15 year period. However, what we're seeing is that because of the repeated bleaching, there's parts of the reef that are now dead. And if we see these trends continue, by somewhere around about 2035 or 2040, all the coral reefs on the planet will actually have died off. Now, the causes of the bleaching is due to 2 things. One is the higher than average ocean temperatures, and so the coral obviously can't adapt to that higher than average temperature. And what we see is the bleaching is caused by the higher than average ocean temperatures. The other thing that creates a problem too is, along with the ocean temperatures being higher, there's also been an increase in acidification. And so over the last 30 years, there's been a 30% increase in ocean acidification. And the challenge this creates, of course, is that it has an impact not only on coral, but it also has an impact on other marine life. And I'll talk a little bit later about shellfish and prawns. And of course, the challenge is that as the increase in acid levels occurs in oceans, then we see problems with shellfish. Their shells get damaged and can even get softened from and don't develop properly as a result of that level of acid. Here were examples of, we've got an example of Vietnam. We've got a significant amount of plastic pollution. What's interesting here in this photograph is this young boy is collecting drinking straws. Now, what's been really interesting over the last 12 or 18 months is, if anyone's been to a club or a pub over that period, what we can see in Australia is that there's been a significant reduction in plastic straw use. In fact, now many clubs and pubs only provide wax paper straws and not plastic straws, and they only provide them when you ask for them. So about 18 months ago, there was the War on Waste television show on the ABC, and what they identified was some of the issues with particularly straws and plastic pollution. I think there was about 8 million straws used per annum in Australia, and of course most of them end up in landfill or end up back in the ocean, and so it creates a significant issue. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit again later about plastic pollution. Now, we also have rising ocean levels as well. Now, here's a photo from Kiribati, and Kiribati is really interesting because a couple of years ago, the government of Kiribati actually went and purchased land in Fiji, and the intent was to actually repatriate the population. Because of ocean levels rising, the Kiribati is likely to be the first country that actually goes underwater as a result of climate change. And so the government was going to actually move its population to Fiji. But if you've seen the media over the last couple of weeks, you'll see that Fiji is also facing similar challenges, and as are many low-lying coral atolls throughout the Pacific Ocean. Now, some people think that it's actually the melting ice caps that actually in glaciers that create the rising sea levels, and that adds some to some of it. But in fact, the bigger issue is that when you actually heat water, water expands. And so because of the higher average ocean temperatures, as I mentioned earlier, the water is actually expanding, and the only way it can go is, of course, up, and it sort of then starts to cover some of those low-lying coral atolls. Then when we look at CO2, we've heard about CO2 and carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gases over the last few years, and it's in the media almost every week. And so we've had a significant increase in CO2 over the last few years. And so when scientists have drilled into ice in the Antarctic over the last number of years, what they've found is that over the last 800,000 years, there's been an oscillation between the glacial and interglacial periods of between 191 and around about 300 parts per million of CO2. And so they can measure the CO2 concentrations in the air bubbles trapped in ice cores. And so what they've found is that it's been pretty consistent, and we can see the fluctuations over time in the glacial and interglacial periods in this graph. Now, when we got to about 1950, we've actually seen a significant increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and we're around about 415 parts per million. Now, that's about 0.04%. And some people say, yeah, you know what, that's really not that much CO2, but it doesn't take a lot to actually create any particular problem. Now, if we look at 0.04% of cyanide or 0.04% of arsenic, both of those are lethal doses. And so, once again, it doesn't take a large amount to create a particular issue. All of this increase is as a result of burning fossil fuels, and the scientists that are measuring CO2 in the atmosphere, they're looking for a particular isotope of carbon, and those particular isotopes only come from fossil fuels and the burning of fossil fuels, and so it's directly related to humans burning fossil fuels. Now, I mentioned also oceans, and we mentioned ocean plastics before. Plastics have been produced by humans. They're not naturally occurring as you expect, and they come as a result of a petrochemical process. Now, in 2025, there's around about 1 tonne of plastic for 3 tonnes of fish, and if that rate of growth continues, by 2050, we'll have a tonne of plastic for every tonne of fish, and beyond that, of course, there'll be more plastic than fish in the ocean. Now, the challenge we see is that all the plastics that we've created are either burnt, in which case it creates toxic fumes in the atmosphere, or they end up in landfill or back in the ocean. And the challenge we're seeing already is that we as humans are ingesting plastic as part of our food chain. We're eating ocean fish. Ocean fish are eating smaller fish, or microbes or plankton and so on, and what they're all actually, what's resulting from all of that is we're actually absorbing plastic, and so the plastics break down into microscopic plastics. They're eaten by other things lower in the food chain, and then when we eat the ocean fish, we then actually eat a certain amount of plastic in our diet. Now, foods are a real challenge, and we're seeing significant pressures on growing conditions as a result of changing climate and also changing rainfall patterns. Now, I presented a number of years ago to some delegation from the government of Sri Lanka, and the challenge that they're seeing is that there's significant rapid changes in growing conditions and rainfall over the last 20 years. And the problem they're having is producing the quantities at the quality level of tea. And so this is having a significant potential impact on their economy. The tea industry is the largest employer in Sri Lanka. And of course, because of rainfall and changing growing conditions, they can't produce the volumes of tea that they've been used to in the past. We're seeing the same problems with coffee. We're seeing the same problems with cocoa beans. Where for Starbucks with coffee, for example, the number one risk on their risk register is the actual production of quality coffee and securing and sourcing the volume of beans they need at the right quality to produce coffee for all their shops around the world. Now, we're seeing the same thing in places like Portugal. So last year we were in Portugal and speaking to growers in Portugal, and they have two issues. One is that 99% of the world's cork populations are grown in Portugal, and they're seeing the cork trees starting to die off because of the changing growing conditions. Likewise with vines, the vines aren't bearing fruit. They're flowering and fruiting at different times of the year. And if you talk to many involved with growing grapes, they're finding that the grapes are actually fruiting 6 to 8 weeks earlier than they were only 10 years ago. In places like Portugal, the quality, the sugar concentrations, and the amount of water in the grapes is also changing rapidly because of changing growing conditions. We're seeing the same problems for beer companies, because of course they're having to use all natural ingredients, hops, barley, malt, and so on, to actually produce beer, and it's getting the volumes at the required quality levels to ensure that there's consistency in their natural products. Now, I mentioned also earlier seafood, and so one of the challenges that's been created with seafood is that because of the increasing ocean levels of acid, we're seeing that there's impacts on prawn populations. As the ocean acid levels increase, the shells on the shellfish become soft, and therefore the seafood becomes prone to different kinds of disease and so on. And so we're seeing potential impacts on our food sources as a result of rapidly changing climate conditions.